Okay, let's get started. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wilton Library. And welcome back after 4 weeks of wonderful presentations on this Victorian novel. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. By the way, folks, many of you know, some of you may not, the town gives us a grant which funds the operations of the building and the operations of the library, but all of our books and CDs, DVDs, our resources, our online databases, and all of our programs are funded every year by private donations that we need to raise. So we really appreciate the support of our donors. And if you would like to join their ranks or continue, there's a big fat button right in the middle of our homepage. And we're in the home stretch to June 30. That's the end of our fiscal year. So appreciate that. Because we have a large audience, we'll handle the Q&A at the end as follows. You can send me your questions using the Q&A button, and I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. And Mark is also happy to answer questions that you can email him later. Okay, quick program note. We're about to start a poetry series. Judson Scruton, many of you know him, will start on July 8 and go for 4 Thursdays at 10:30 in the morning. And Judson will be surveying the poetry and thought of W.H. Auden. So we're looking forward to that. It starts July 8th. Fairly soon it'll be on our website to sign up, but there'll be plenty of room. So that's just a heads up. Before I turn this over to Mark, I want to thank all of you for coming and participating. Great questions and comments, both live and also in the follow-ups to Mark directly. And of course, I want to thank Mark for giving us a great series. We are very happy that we've already got him lined up for another one. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Michael. And Michael's given me permission to say that the next series will be in October, 4 sessions. The format, whether remote or in person, remains to be decided, but the books are decided. 4 modern British fiction works: The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, Howard's End by E.M. Foster, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and Brighton Rock by Graham Greene. That's one novel from each of the first 4 decades of the 20th century, and you will see what happens to the Victorian novel in the decades following Victoria's demise. So tonight we're doing Tess of the D'Urbervilles, published in 1891. Thomas Hardy had the good fortune to be born in 1840, the middle of the Victorian period, 30 years before Dickens died, and to live until 1928. That's not only 88 years, that's a heck of an 88 years. So in the middle of the 19th century and old enough to see the First World War and the sinking of the Titanic, he wrote poems about both those events. So with Tess, we have a radically different novel from any of the 3 we've seen so far. If Middlemarch breaks some of the mold of the first 2 novels we read, it keeps many of them. I mentioned last time that we'll see tonight that Tess is a kind of anti-Victorian novel, and I hope to make good on that claim as I take you through it. So with this novel, we return to the apparent pattern of the coming-of-age novel that centers on a single individual, as we saw with Jane Eyre and with Pip. And with that, we have the trajectory of Tess's sad life marked also by a series of geographic locations, as with Jane Eyre's movement from Gateshead Hall to Lowood to Thornfield to Morehouse, and then back for a second time to fulfillment at Thornfield, Rochester's destroyed estate. And we've seen a similar route in Great Expectations, where Pip moves from the marsh to the forge to Sada's house to London, and then attempts a return to the old neighborhood and to Becky that does not result in fulfillment. In Tess, the stations, and I'm using that word purposely, not so much to invoke the Stations of the Cross, but the idea that they are very specific and well-described geographical locations on this trajectory of her life. So we begin in the home village of Morlott, then the D'Urberville estate at Tantridge, where she's exploited by Alec. And let me make it clear, we don't know what Hardy thought he was doing, whether that was a rape or a seduction or something in between. The Victorian censorship would not have allowed him to be specific, but it's clear that whatever Alec does, he took advantage of a young and weary and essentially lost Tess. So I don't want you to think that when I avoid the word seduction or rape, I'm making a politically correct decision. He clearly abuses her, and it's a violation without doubt. Then she moves to the dairy farm called Tabitha's, where she meets Angel, a relatively happy place. Then after Angel rejects her, a short and unsuccessful return to Marlott, followed immediately by the harsh work she has to undertake at Flickham Ash Farm, a truly wasteland-like landscape. This is chapter 43, over which we're told she and another girl are crawling to dig up the half-eaten roots of turnips, and they're described as moving like flies. This is a much darker novel than the first we read. Then we briefly move to Angel's parents' home in Emminster, where she abandons her plan to engage them and instead chooses to return to Flickham Ash, but instead encounters Alec again and agrees to live with him in exchange for shelter and support. And of course, she and Angel unintentionally wind up, but much to their author's intention, on the plains of Stonehenge, which Tess calls a heathen temple, and which Angel notes is older than the centuries, older than the D'Urbervilles. So let's talk about some of the themes and motifs we've tracked in other novels. The centrality of marriage and family is connected in all these novels to the role of women and their lack of standing. Think about what a different novel Dickens would have written if Great Expectations were told from Estella's point of view. I'm not sure Dickens would have been capable of that, but she could have a story to tell as well, and it would be very revealing of Victorian mores. In chapter 23 of Tess, when the 4 young dairymaids, including her, are blocked on a Sunday morning from going to church by a flooded country lane, Angel offers and then carries the 4 of them, Marian, Is, Reddy, and Tess across, saving Tess quite intentionally for laughs. As he carries her across, he tells her, "Do you know that I have undergone 3/4 of this labor entirely for the sake of the 4th quarter?" She does not mind the attention, but the reason I bring this up is that in the serial publication of the novel, most Victorian novels were published first in monthly installments, usually several chapters at a time, that would run for a year, sometimes 2 years. This is true of most of Dickens, it was true of Middlemarch, true of most novels, because lower middle-class family homes could not afford the triple-decker novel when it came out, but they couldn't afford the installments, which were in magazines that also had ads and other products, so they were partly subsidized. When it came out in serial publication, which omitted all of chapter 14, the chapter in which Tess baptizes her doomed baby Sorrow and is transformed. In fact, the serial version of the novel omitted any reference to the baby. So as far as the readers of the serial version knew, although she was exploited, she did not become pregnant. Well, what's even more striking is in this episode of Angel carrying the 4 maidens across the flood, the editors, without Hardy's permission, changed it to his using a wheelbarrow for each of the women in turn. A wheelbarrow. And the reason they did it is they felt that readers seeing a young man carry 4 maidens, that is 4 virgins, across a threshold by carrying them in his arms the way that's described, holding the women in front of him, their arms around his neck, would make readers think that it was a bridal scene of a young man taking a woman to be his bride, and not just one woman, but 4 women. And so they would have thought, the editors believe, the readers would think, that he had had what my foster mother used to call carnival knowledge of them. And without Hardy's permission, they changed it to a wheelbarrow. He was outraged. He agreed to publish the novel as a book only if chapter 14 and this particular episode was restored. But I bring up this point to say what Hardy is saying about England in the 1870s, when the novel is set 20 years before it's published, then because there's a great sort of agricultural depression in England at that time, one of several in the 19th century, that the kind of forces that bedevil Tess are bedeviling its author. And the narrowness of the Victorian social convention led to Hardy, after he published Jude the Obscure, his final novel, 5 years after this, to give up novel writing for the rest of his long life, which was over 30 years. For the rest of his life, he wrote memoirs and excellent poetry, but he gave up on novel writing because he couldn't bear the pettiness of Victorian social conscience. So I mentioned that although Tess is not an orphan, she has a mother who we're told has the intelligence of a happy child, and a father who, once he loses Prince, the horse that Tess unavoidably gets murdered from her point of view, she might as well be an orphan. And part of what happens is she's sent off to make a family connection that she feels burdened by because she fell asleep when Prince drifted over to the wrong side. Although her mother has the intelligence of a happy child, the advice she gives to Tess in the letter that opens chapter 31, and in this part of my talk, I'm focusing on the role and lack of influence of women in the period. She tells Tess to keep her, quote, bygone trouble, unquote, from her future husband, knowing that that's good wisdom of plain country folk. Now, I want to say, if that advice were given to a character in a novel by Bronte or Dickens or George Eliot, or probably people like Gaskell and even Thackeray, the novelist would feel that that was the wrong advice because the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, is to be candid and to hope your future spouse will embrace you all the same. Tess follows not her mother's advice, but what Victorian novelists would ordinarily do because she's a pure woman, we're told in the subtitle. She tells Angel in chapter 35, when he disowns her, I'm only a peasant by position, not by nature. And by position, she means class. And more than any of the other novels, Hardy is embracing the tension between what people are by nature and what they are by class. He is much more of a naturalist, both in the sense of setting a landscape. In Far From the Madding Crowd, the landscape is virtually another character in the novel, and lots of important landscape descriptions in this novel, much more detailed than the relatively urban Dickens and the village-scape of Middlemarch. So she expects more from her Angel, and she expects more from herself, so she tells him the truth, belatedly, and only when she's encouraged because he has told her actually a much worse truth. But of course, she's woefully disappointed. And she's disappointed because the universe of Hardy's novels does not care about the purity of intentions. It does not care about goodness. It does not care about honesty or character. It grinds you down because it does. To understand Hardy, you have to understand that he is writing a novel that purports to be in the Victorian mode. He knows what readers want, in order to frustrate them by saying, this is not how the world works. The world doesn't work by giving you second chances. So when she thinks that the letter has been delivered in chapter 33, and then realizes it hasn't because she discovers it under the rug, has to be one of the great little bits of business in all of 19th century fiction. And then they have their paired confessions in chapter 34. We're told after she speaks, and we don't hear her dialogue, that the essence of things had changed. And in fact, he says to her, Angel, you were one person, now you are another. That radical transformation is not natural. Nothing about Tess's character has changed. Nothing about her biologically, empirically, naturally has changed. It's all a matter of convention. And here's what we need to understand if you want to appreciate Hardy's fiction. I'm sorry, Hardy's fiction. That the power of social position, the power of conventionality, the power of Victorian narrow-mindedness creates, as he writes at the end of chapter 41, a sense of condemnation under an arbitrary law of society which had no foundation in nature. But, and here's the important kicker, it has the force of nature. That is, this is a tragic novel, not because, as in Shakespeare, people's characters are deeply flawed, or not because in the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans were fascinated by the indifference of fate. Fate was not merciful, it was blind and just. The reference to justice at the end of this novel is not only ironic, but parodic. It's a parody of the Victorian novel. What's key is he knows the condemnation that's given by society has no foundation in nature, but it has the force of nature, which is what makes it tragic. It is as inevitable and as unavoidable as nature, which is why they end up on Stonehenge, which is why so much attention is given to a natural landscape. So the interest in class consciousness, the interest in getting ahead, suffuses the novel from the very beginning when her father is told, by accident kind of, that he's connected to aristocrats who are associated from the very beginning with death. He's told that his family's extinct. Conversation turns to where they're buried. His father has foolish aspirations in this regard. The mother has wishes to at least connect with the family. What sets the whole tragedy in motion is that idea of getting into upper class society. In Wuthering Heights, a terrific example of a mid-Victorian novel that is phenomenally class conscious. So many characters in that novel want to get in. They want to get in. The outsider, Heathcliff, finds that as an outsider, he might be destroyed by that society. He finds a way in by becoming a landowner, by becoming someone who controls wills and trusts, and he uses that power as a club to seek revenge on the younger generation of the people who have thwarted him. He is a natural child who finds he has to become social in order to be vengeful. So we've talked at some length about the domesticated Gothic. Here, the Gothic is so powerful, it's not even really domesticated. That is, it's not really tamed. The Gothic wins out. The scene in Stonehenge, primitive, older than the centuries, older than the D'Urbervilles, dominate. The last sense we have of Tess's fate, we don't see her, we don't hear her. She's not even mentioned by name in the passage where the black flag goes up. The black flag tells us in Gothic, primitive, stark terms, all we need to know. She had been killed. It's an ending that I think Hardy intentionally meant to be unsatisfying. So the novel's domesticated Gothic arises from this interest in the power of fate. The novel seems to be set in a time much earlier than the 1870s when it occurs, on a vast and seemingly pre-industrial rural landscape that verges on the medieval. And here I'm thinking again of Stonehenge. The railroads have come into vogue in the 30s and 40s, and certainly by the 1870s, they're a feature all over the English countryside. They have, in a way, homogenized English culture, because if you were living in a town that had a Saints' Day on the 3rd of May and you were closed, you couldn't be part of the national grid because they couldn't afford to have trains run through a local station that would be closed. So little towns had to stop having their local observances. And women who had nothing to do could sell flowers at the train station. Men could sell wares or sandwiches at the train station. And it became a part of the landscape and economic landscape of Victorian England. You would not know that there were railroads or much industrialization. One of the striking things about this novel is that Tess walks incessantly. She is beaten down by the mere size of the landscape. Everywhere she goes, nearly, she is walking. And the one time we see her early on with the mail cart is part of this chain of fate that suffuses the entire novel. So the news of his ancestors that Jack Durbeyfield receives leads to his drunken celebration that results in having to send a too-tired Tess, who agrees from a combination of duty, she's a moral girl, and pride. She doesn't want her mother to ask one of the men because she's embarrassed that her father reacted to the news that way. So she drives with her brother to a market some 25 miles away. That's a great distance for a little cart. And that results in their horse Prince, not an accidental name, being impaled by the morning mail cart, which was speeding along the road like an arrow. Tess can be stopped, but the mail cannot be stopped. The mail cart man tells her in chapter 4, you was on the wrong side. And that could be the emblem of Tess's life for the entire novel. Indeed, as early as the closing of chapter 4, the chapter in which that follows the death of Prince, there's a foreshadowing of Tess's end when the narrator tells us that as she stands by the side of the grave that her father is digging for Prince, a grave, we're told, that replaces the garden that her father had worked on for months to feed his family. So she's not only killed Prince, his only real means of livelihood. To bury Prince, the father has to give up on a garden that would feed his family. We're told by the narrator, as she stands by the graveside, Tess's face was dry and pale, as though she regarded herself in the light of a murderess. And that's a foreshadowing at the very beginning of the novel. And of course, that fact results in Tess being sent to the D'Urbervilles and on and on and on. Much more than any of the novels we have read this season, much more than most Victorian novels, the chain of circumstance seems inexorable. The Gothic also predominates over the description of the chase, C-H-A-S-E, that dark area where Alex takes Tess. In chapter 11, at the end of the first phase, we hear of vapor and fog and thick darkness and obscurity and pale nebulousness. That phrase describes how he sees Tess lying at his feet. She's a pale, nebulous cloud. And there's reference to the primeval yews and oats. The act of her exploitation is a natural one. I only mean biological. I don't mean it should happen. I don't mean appropriate. It's a matter of biology, but it takes place in a supernatural landscape, and the consequences are decidedly social. We're told by the narrator that an immense social chasm was to divide our heroine's personality thereafter from that previous self of hers. There's nothing like that in Pip, because Pip is a man, a boy and a man. There's nothing like that in Jane Eyre, because Jane Eyre's trajectory is going to have her succeed. But Tess is doomed. Her misery, we're told in chapter 14, where we see her with her baby, is created not by her innate sensation. She's not unhappy. She's not grieving internally just because she's not strong, but rather, quote, by her conventional aspect, that is, how she's seen by social convention. That's what condemns her. That's what damns her. And there are lots of touches of the Gothic when Angel reacts to her confession in chapter 35 and can't believe that she was so matter of fact in the telling of her lost innocence that she never wept and she never seemed really sorry and is not acting the way he expects a penitent woman to act. He reacts with what we're told is horrible laughter, as unnatural and ghastly as a laugh in hell. This is what I mean when I say it's not the kind of domesticated Gothic where the Gothic overtones of Rochester and his estate and his first wife in the attic are all finally undone by ESP and fire and healing and all of that. Here, that horrible laughter that's as ghastly and unnatural as a laugh in hell, that's Angel. That's Angel's reaction. And it comes not from an author painting a kind of mood, but from Angel's character, which is absolutely rooted in this unfairness to women. When Tess is at the ancestral sepulcher of the D'Urbervilles in chapter 52, nearing the end of the sixth phase, and that idea of it being phases suggests that there's something natural, like the trajectory of the moon in these different episodes of Tess's life. I want to make it clear, Hardy's playing with that idea of natural, while he's constantly making the point that it's really society that does her in, and it seems so powerful that people take it for nature. If you can keep that idea as a takeaway from this lecture, you'll understand the foundation of Hardy's view of his idea of a Victorian novel. So when she's at that sepulcher in chapter 52, at the end of the sixth phase, she bends down at the entrance of the vaults and asks, "Why am I on the wrong side of this door?" That is, she echoes her being on the wrong side of the road some 48 chapters earlier, when Prince is killed because a sleeping Tess had drifted to the wrong side of the road, for reasons we know. And of course, the letter that she slips under the door of Angel's room in chapter 33 winds up on the wrong side of the carpet. When she tells her brother, Abraham, in chapter 4, that the planets in the sky are like apples on a tree, most of them splendid, but a few blighted, Abraham asks, "Are we on a blighted one or a splendid one?" And Tess looks at her notes and says, "Wait, we're in a Hardy novel. Of course, we're on a blighted one." And he said, "Well, but that's odd. The odds would be in our favor that we'd be on a splendid one." Tess knows enough about the world, in her intelligence, in her stoicism, that she knows that early that they're living on a blighted apple. Hardy objected to being characterized as a pessimist in his novels. He thought he was a kind of realist who was trying to override the sentimentality of the Victorian novel, which would end with, "Reader, I married him." You know, if you take the point of view of someone like Hardy, Jane Eyre is a sentimental melodrama when you think about how everything wraps up neatly the way that it does. And it isn't until his next to last novel that Dickens has the fortitude to write a novel with a tougher ending than the ones he usually does. This idea of being on the wrong side is Hardy's way of saying the Victorian reader has to be prepared that fiction is not just a matter of happy endings, and neither is life. So I don't have a separate spiel on anxiety because the novel is fraught with anxiety at every level. The idea that the D'Urbervilles are anxious to make their fortune even though the parson tells them the family that you're connected to is extinct, and even though all the references to them are connected to tombs. And of course, Tess is anxious throughout the novel in different ways, including the long, difficult passage where she tries to figure out how to share her news with Angel. And it would be laughable that this woman who was exploited by a man who is a nominal relative is treated or has to worry about being on the same level of guilt and confession as Angel, who led a licentious life. And of course, the difference is one of them is female and one of them is male. And Hardy objects to that consistently in his fiction. So near the end of, in chapter 55, rather, near the start of the seventh and final phase of Tessa's story, an ill and emaciated Angel returns to ask Tess for forgiveness. And so we have, at this point of the novel, both of the men in her life, Alec and Angel, being engaged in attempted or actual second chances with Tess. So, Jane Eyre doesn't get really a second chance with St. John, but she does with Rochester, and she's rewarded for it. The fact that there are two suitors, I'll call them that, two potential husbands, who each get two chances, is an indication that Hardy is having fun in this very somber novel with the Victorian template. Because we've observed Ebenezer Scrooge is afforded a second chance. That's in the 1840s. And David Copperfield in 1850 and Jane Eyre in 1847 are offered second chances. Dorothea Brooke, as late as 1871, is offered a second chance and gets it. Pip attempts one, but he's denied because his creator is punishing the young man and his own younger self for his earlier arrogance. But not so Tess. No second chances for Tess. And again, the fact that she has two men, each of whom seek a second chance, suggests that Hardy is quite consciously making an overt parody of the idea of the Victorian sentimental happy ending novel. It also reminds us that his readers in 1891 are being asked to recognize that it's a very different time from the high Victorian period of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. We call them all Victorian because Victoria had the good fortune to live and reign until 1901. But most literary historians end the high Victorian period with the death of Dickens in 1870, a convenient date, and see the last decades of the 19th century as suffused with fin de siècle, art for art's sake, an interest in ideas of civilization being corrupt. Oscar Wilde suggesting that all that matters is style, conventional morality doesn't matter anymore. It's a much darker time because it's approaching the end of a 100-year cycle. There's a lot of sense of civilization coming to an end. Hardy doesn't think that's the reason it's so dark. He believes that the Victorian novel has always been a kind of cheat in pretending that life fits this sort of happy ending. So when Angel returns at that point to connect again to the wife that he so bitterly cast off, Tess at this point is completely broken and can only repeat to him, too late, too late. A chapter later, she has killed Alec, and not a lot of narrative time is given to that. And by chapter 58, she and Angel have wandered their way to Stonehenge. We see and hear Tess for the last time as she awakens to find herself an Angel surrounded by police on the plains of Stonehenge and about to be taken into custody for the killing of Alec. Her last words in the novel are, "I am ready." I want to suggest to you that one way to improve your reading of novels that are realistic fiction and that have a lot of dialogue, that is, that you can imagine as you read it, it being a play or a movie, that it's interesting to think about what the curtain line of a particular chapter or a particular of the novel itself would be. It's significant that the last thing that Tess utters is too late, and there's more dialogue after that, but then her final words are, I am ready. And we don't see her again, we don't hear her again. Hardy quite intentionally created the last chapter, chapter 59, one short of 60, as an anticlimax. And to those readers, and one of you wrote me a question about the novel earlier today, and I declined to answer it in the hopes that possibly this lecture would answer it. But I say to that patron, if this lecture has not answered it, you have my email address. Please feel free to write me or write to me again through Michael. I'm not avoiding answering the question. I'm hoping this lecture will partly do it. He means to have written a decidedly unsatisfactory ending to the novel. It must have struck some of you that the finale at the end of Middlemarch, which goes into some detail about the Garth marriage, and of course ends finally with Dorothea and the beautiful ending about unhistoric acts that spread goodness throughout the world, has a kind of post-mortem on Lydgate, who never lived long enough to have his hair go gray, dies at 50, and is a successful doctor in a very narrow sense of success. The fact that a character that was so central to the theme and plot of the novel is relegated to that little sort of paragraph of post-mortem suggests more than even what is written about how far he's fallen in this tragic ending. Tess is not given a tragic ending. She doesn't get to stand on some scaffold. She doesn't get to weep through the bars and talk to her sister. She doesn't say to Angel, Angel, I want you to be happy with my sister. Let me introduce you to Tess 2.0, you know, kind of second best. She just is erased. She doesn't appear. She's rather represented in that last chapter by what the narrator calls her spiritualized image, her sister, Liza Lou. Now, when Becky wins Joe instead of Pip, and they have a child, that Pip 2.0 is not a spiritualized image of Pip. It's a real boy, and a real boy to deserving parents, and suggests that happiness is possible to people who live a good life. That's not a parody of a happy ending. It's a happy ending for Joe and a happy ending for Becky, even though it's not a conventionally happy one for Pip. But of course, that's not conventional Dickens. And in the broader sense, the lessons that Estella has learned about being bent and broken into a better shape, and what she hopes Pip will have recognized either in his own experience or by her parting from him, is a different kind of happy ending, a kind of autumnal Dickens. But Hardy is the great master of writing novels that seem to offer a second chance and then not giving it. And here's a little spoiler alert, but the Mayor of Casabridge, published in 1886, one of Hardy's more famous novels, published 5 years before Tess. And here I'm going to tell you a very basic thing about the plot that will not ruin this very big and complicated novel, even if you remember it. The Mayor of Casabridge is a man who early in the novel, opening pages, has gotten drunk at a kind of fair and makes a bet with an itinerant or passing through soldier or sailor, and says if he loses, he will give that man his wife and daughter in his drunkenness. And the sailor has the good sense not to accept that bet, but the wife is so outraged that she says to the sailor, win, lose, or draw, I'm not staying with him, I'm leaving with you. The suggestion isn't that she's going to move in with him. The suggestion is that she's so upset with her drunken husband, whose name is Michael Henchard, he's not yet the mayor, that she's going to leave him and go somewhere else. And the novel continues in her absence by explaining that Michael Henchard has become a a contrite man. He believes in his own reformation. He stops drinking, and in the fullness of time, son of a gun, he becomes the mayor of the town, the mayor of Casabridge. So if this were a conventional Victorian novel, and 1886 is too late for that, he would be given a second chance. He'd take it, and read her, she married him. But it's Hardy. And so what happens? His wife and daughter come back to him, and they're delighted. The daughter now is a young woman, delighted that he's cleaned up his act, and the wife is willing to forgive him. And it's clear she's partly back because he now has class. He has an income and some status in the community. But what Henchard doesn't know, and which we eventually find out, is his first daughter died. And this daughter is not his daughter, but the daughter by another man. And when he tries to be a good husband and father, son of a gun, he gets drunk again and loses them a second time. That is, Hardy says to his reader, you know how to read a Victorian novel. I'm going to write you 3/4 of one. And then I'm going to thwart your expectations by suggesting that some people in the actual world do not get a second chance because they don't clean up their act. When Raymond Chandler was a young man, he worked as I may have some of these facts wrong, but some kind of worker on an industrial site or a factory. And he had a habit of coming in late to work. And his boss, who thought he was a good worker when he showed up, said to him, if you'll promise me never to be late again, I'll let you back in and have your job. And Raymond Chandler, who wasn't 25, he might not have been 20, said to him, look, we both know I'm going to do it again. It would be a joke for me to suggest I'm not going to sleep in and be late again. So, I can, in all honesty, make that promise. And he went about his way, did not take the job back. And that was very characteristic of Raymond Chandler's view of himself and of the world. You don't always succeed when you're given a second chance. And with an eye towards, I'm going to say next term, but to October, at least 2 of the novels that we'll be talking about play with this notion of what's it like to get a second chance. And other novels of the period, Lord Jim in Conrad's novel fails at something and is offered a second chance. To the Lighthouse has 2 parts where something is attempted and not accomplished, and then there's a second chance in the second half. And that's Virginia Woolf. E.M. Foster's Passage to India is very much about second chances. And then Graham Greene's great later novel, The End of the Affair, which has been made into a good movie twice, one of my favorite novels, is also about the whole question of second chances. All of those novels of the first half of the 20th century, are very aware of their literary forebears in the 19th century and this idea that fiction promises a kind of happy ending. Hardy will have none of that. In The Importance of Being Earnest, which was published in the same decade as Tess of the D'Urberville, Oscar Wilde, and let me say, if you have never read or seen, or have not recently read or seen, I seem to be giving the tip of the week with respect to film and drama, but a good reading or viewing of The Importance of Being Earnest, besides being one of the funniest works of literature, I think, ever, will give you a very good idea of a wit's view of Victorian conventionality. And so one character in that play says of a novel that was written, in the novel, the good are rewarded and the evil are punished. And then she adds, that's why they call it fiction. That's Wilde in the humorous key of the same kind of distrust of Victorian sentimentality that we have seen now in Hardy. It was Oscar Wilde who said of the old curiosity shop where little Nell spends several chapters dying at a really poignant deathbed scene. He said famously, one would have to have a heart of stone to read of the death of little Nell and not laugh. So by the 1890s, the sentiment, the template of A Christmas Carol has gone out of the Victorian novel and replaced by different things as we see here. So I hope that's as good a mini overview. I'm going to end, as always, with some time for you to ask questions, but I want to make it clear I did not pick what I think are the 4 best novels, and I seem to have caused some consternation by saying some comments about Wuthering Heights. Lord knows the trouble I got myself in by promoting the lives of others, but I don't have to defend movie choices, I hope. What I hope to do in the series is to have you read 4 important novels. Literary history has said that's true, by 4 very important writers of the period over a chronological span, each of whom are kind of suffused with different aspects of Victorianism, some of which are quite consistent. This notion of class consciousness, this idea of having a Gothic dimension that is never quite too scary, but it gets scarier by the time we get to Tess. This is the same decade that Dracula was published by an Irish writer, but published in England, and a very scary book. People are no longer as interested in hedging their bets about fearfulness. For one thing, they've begun to worry that death is the end of life and that there's nothing on the other side. And that creates a great cultural anxiety that coincides with the end of the 19th century, when some people thought, as people do at the end of every century, that the world would be coming to an end. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Michael. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Mark. Well, that was really great. It certainly helped me a lot in appreciating this book, and I'm glad you spent a lot of time on the unsatisfying aspect of the ending, which had me snapping pencils in half when I got to the end of the book. First question is, what was it in Hardy's life or upbringing, if anything, that had him so irritated with and angered by the Victorian mores?
Yeah. So I understand why someone would ask that question. The best answer I can give is you would have to read at least a good article in an encyclopedia or Wikipedia to get an idea of Hardy's life. I myself would resist thinking that there's something happened in his life that angered or irritated him. What happened in his life is he was paying attention to what happened in Victorian England. The things that he's objecting to are the way the world really was. And as good as Dickens is as a novelist, Dickens is essentially a caricaturist. That is, he's writing a kind of dream vision with nightmarish characters, and as I've mentioned, characters who act more like things. Broken. Give him a nod. There you go, Agent P. There's a nod for you. A kind of charming cartoonishness that some people despise and other people are charmed by. There's nothing like that in George Eliot, 1870s, that we looked at. Nothing like that in the 1880s and 1890s in Hardy. These are writers who think that the readership needs to grow up. And so I don't think it's a simple, I don't object to the question, I appreciate the question, but I think Hardy had a completely different view of how reality worked. The last poem that he published, not the last poem that he wrote, is a poem entitled, and again, after Jude the Obscure, for the last 2 decades of his life, he wrote nothing but poetry. He's at least as good a poet as he was a novelist, remarkably good poet, very influential on 20th century British writers. He publishes, as the last poem that he publishes, and in many collected editions of his work, it appears at the end. I think the title is Christmas 1924, so a few years before he died. And the poem reads something like this. This is a pretty close quotation or paraphrase. Peace on earth, we sing it, and we pay 1,000 priests to bring it. after 2,000 years of Christian mass, we've come as far as poison gas. This is a post-World War I poem. World War I shattered any notion of Victorian gentility and civilization. World War I reminded people of the Gothic that is not domesticated, just a horror. And of course, Hardy's point is civilization has gotten so sophisticated that it can create poison gas. And that poison gas rhymes with Christian mass is a brilliant undercutting of the effect of Christian religion. That's Hardy. He did not think he was a pessimist. He thought he was a realist, and he thought he was what he called a meliorist. That is, that the world is slowly ameliorating. It's slowly getting better, but very, very slowly, which is why his novels are often connected to older periods of time. You don't get the sense that the years that pass in Tess make any radical change. The nature of tragedy is things basically stay the way they are. The hallmark of comedy is if you wait a while, things get better. Things turn out all right at the end. Nobody knows why, says Tom Stoppard in Shakespeare in Love. It just does. In tragedy, doesn't matter how long you wait. In the end, you're still dead. In the end, things are still dire.
So this is a little bit related to part of what you just said. Did Hardy believe in fatalism as seen in his novels and poetry, even though he was a realist?
Yeah, so I want to say that in his, I'll limit it to the novel. In the novel, he's using fatalism, I think, as a literary device more than he actually believes in, because he's trying to counterbalance the coincidences that happen in Victorian novels, where in Dickens, if a boy meets a girl and they're not married, they're brother and sister, and where Oliver Twist picks the pocket of a man the first time he's been trained to be a thief by Fagin, and the pocket of the man whose pocket it is a friend of his family who he's never met. He's trying to suggest that if the sentimental novel can go to the extreme of melodrama, he's going to be more steel-eyed with the notion of fate. But I don't think he thinks that fate is what dominates all life. And I think, like any good writer of tragedy, he recognizes that characters are also complicit in their fate. Tess is proud. We're told that very early on. She's good looking, she's smart, she's dutiful, and she's proud. And those things all weigh in her fate. She decides that once she knows before their wedding that Angel hasn't read the letter, it's not her fault that the letter went under the carpet, but it is her fault that she decides all the same not to tell him. And when they have their terrible argument, she says, well, I thought you could just divorce me. I figured that if I was kind of hoping against hope that you treat me as well as I'm treating you. But if you didn't, you could just divorce me. And he basically calls her an idiot and says, there's no way I could divorce you and be burdened that way. I want to say before we're out of time that I have in my old copy of Tess of the D'Urberville, this very old, probably from the 1970s, Peanuts cartoon. Now, Charles Schulz died over 20 years ago, so this is an old cartoon, but it shows Charlie Brown, his friend Linus, and Linus's younger brother Rerun watching TV on a couch. And Charlie Brown says, this guy on TV says sports are all fathers and sons talk about. And Linus says, what else is there to talk about? And Rerun, the child, says Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And I used to photocopy this and put it on the exam booklet I handed out to students when I taught in the 80s at Trinity College and in the early 90s at Yale. And now I can't do that anymore because students know Tess of the D'Urbervilles because it's on their syllabus, but they don't know Peanuts.
So
what is youth coming to?
Exactly. So a couple of two questions that combine to be related. Was the novel popular in its time? Was Hardy popular in his time?
So the novel was popular, partly because it was thought to be scandalous. Hardy was more popular as time went on, and his giving up on novels and not giving people more of the books they enjoyed but also criticized made him even more popular. He was also very beloved by the literary intellectual establishment, both for his novels, and I cannot tell you how strikingly influential his poetry was for other writers at the beginning of the century. Michael mentioned an upcoming series on W.H. Auden, a poet I love and love to teach. But if someone said to me that I could teach a single, hour and a half little class on the poetry of anybody, it's likely that Thomas Hardy would be up there. For one thing, he's very accessible in that he's not elusive. You don't need a large knowledge of mythology or religion or history, philosophy, the way you do with some great poets, which of course is their right. But he is just brilliant. I mean, you saw that 4-line poetry about Christmas 1924 and paying priests to bring blessings of peace now that it's several years after the war, and the darkly cynical notion that poison gas undoes everything that Christian Mass can offer you. He was very well revered by the time he died. He was buried in, I do not mean just by the time he died, in his latter life. And he was buried in Poets' Quarter. And I think he's considered one of the great figures in late 19th, early 20th century literature, and a real rarity that he was a leading Victorian novelist and a leading modern poet. Remarkable. And not just because he lived that way.
That's great. And maybe that might be a good point to stop, and because we could go on and on about a lot of different threads here. And but I just want to thank you again, Mark, for a great series. I learned a lot. I think quite a number of people, judging from the feedback, read I think all 4 books, which is quite impressive. And on your comment earlier, at least a few people told me they immediately did go watch The Lives of Others and thought it was a fantastic recommendation.
I work on commission, Michael. I work on commission. Let me say, if I can say one thing as a last word, I mentioned this earlier, but let me say, one way you can study literature is a kind of geological look. Take a novel like Great Expectations and look over the course of several meetings at its narrative structure, its symbolism, its style, Dickens' background, be intensively examining, exhuming. But another way is you can see where it places itself in the terrain, the landscape of its period, either its period broadly, or in the history of the novel even more broadly, or in the narrow terrain of the works of Dickens. And I call that a kind of topographical survey. And what I look to do in these lectures, where I only have you for 45 or 50 minutes, is to give you a topographical sense of the lay of the land. I know all of you understand that I'm not suggesting that everything I've said that may or may not be true of these 4 novels, depending on whether you believe me, that not everything I've said is going to be true of other novels, or true once you get to digging down deeply. It's a broad overview. There's a great virtue to having a sense of survey. I hope if this course gave you nothing else, it gave you a sense of how alike and unlike these novels are from each other. So thank you, Michael, for the opportunity, and thank you for inviting me back.
Well, thanks again, Mark. Thanks everybody for participating. If you didn't catch it at the beginning, Mark will be back in October with early 20th century English literature, 4 great novels. We'll give you a heads up on that with an email. And the Auden series in July is with our frequent teacher, Judson Scruton, who many of you know. So see you all again soon. Thanks.
And more movie recommendations to come. Thanks, Michael. Thank you all.
Thanks,
well.
Mark. Good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.